So the Calvin cycle needs these energetic molecules because this is an anabolic, it's a building process. We're trying to stick molecules together to make them more organized, and that requires energy. So the whole purpose of the light reactions was just to give us the energy molecules we need, ATP and NADPH. Now at this stage, what we can do is we can take 3 CO2s, so 3 carbons essentially, and we can use this energy, this ATP and NADPH, to stick them together to make a molecule called G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. You don't have to memorize the long version of it, but just understand it's a very small 3-carbon sugar, G3P. This is the ultimate thing that we produce. Now in the process, we use up the ATP, so you can see we've broken it back down into ADP plus just regular phosphate groups. These can get rebuilt into ATP again during the light reactions, so they'll kind of cycle. You'll also see that we've broken down the NADPH back into NADP+, which can also be rebuilt during photosystem 1 of the light reactions back into NADPH, so we can still keep doing that part. But the one thing that we earn, that we get, is this G3P molecule. Now that G3P molecule can be stuck together with another G3P to make glucose. So if we have 2 of these guys, we can get a glucose. There's also a bunch of enzymes that modify G3P, or a bunch of G3Ps, to be proteins, to be nucleic acids, to be any type of carbohydrate you need, to be any type of lipid that we need. So plants can convert this G3P into any organic molecule that they need, for structure, for food, for whatever. But that's the purpose of this Calvin cycle, to make the organic molecules that plants need as either food or structure, so they can grow, so they can store stuff, so they can get by. The Calvin cycle doesn't need light, not directly, but it does indirectly need light because it needs the products from the light reaction. It needs the ATP and it needs the NADPH to function. So you do need light to do all of the process of photosynthesis at some point. You have to have light at some point to make this work. Now there is one problem for plants. Plants need CO2 to do the Calvin cycle. But when they open up these pores that they have in their leaves, the leaves is where photosynthesis typically occurs. So this is a pore called a stomata. And when they open that up, it allows CO2 to come in, but it also allows water in the form of water vapor to leave. That's called transpiration when plants essentially sweat. Now this is a problem for plants because they need to be pressurized. Remember we talked about that they're hypertonic. They need water pressure so that they can be rigid, so they can stand up. And so if they have too little water, they wilt, they die. So for them there's this big dilemma of, do I leave my pores open to get CO2 so I can do photosynthesis? But at the same time, if there's a shortage of water around, if they don't have plenty of water to use, they can also wilt and it can kill them to leave it open. And so there's 3 basic strategies that plants have taken based upon where they live. C3 plants is the default. This is just the normal Calvin cycle. These guys do photosynthesis the fastest. So they're the best at doing photosynthesis, but they're the least efficient at using water. So these guys do the most photosynthesis, I'll just use a P for that, but they also use the most water. So this is their main problem. Whereas when you look at C4 plants, which are commonly weeds, C3 plants are like grasses. So when you look at things that we call weeds, these C4 plants are better at storing CO2 a little bit. They can store it short term. And so they're able to close their stomata more frequently during the day. So that way they can try to lose less water. So these guys are kind of the midpoint, where they can still do photosynthesis fairly fast, not quite as fast, it's a little bit less. But they also use quite a bit less H2O. So this works well in places that experience temporary droughts, where there's not as available water, but it's not a desert. There is still water usually available. So lastly, we've got cam plants that do very little photosynthesis. So if we're looking at this, they do the least amount of photosynthesis. They're the slowest at it. They're the slowest growing plant. But they also use a tiny amount of H2O. So they use very little H2O when it comes down to it, because they keep their pores closed all day long. They store all the CO2 that they're going to use at night when it's cooler out, so there's less evaporation from their pores. So this is things like cacti, what we call succulents, these thicker plants that are very, very, very good at preserving their water. Now they grow slow, so if you want to talk about something growing in an area that's a rainforest, these guys would not do well because they would be outcompeted by everybody else because water's not an issue. But if we're talking about a desert where it consistently lacks water, cam plants thrive. They're the best. So when you're looking at this, just keep in mind that there's always this idea that you can do more photosynthesis, but you also lose more water. You have to have higher water available. And so in a rainforest, being a C3 plant is wonderful. It's probably the best thing you can be. When it gets to be somewhere where there's more restrictions on water, you start to favor C4 plants. And when there's almost universal restrictions on water, cam plants are the best at surviving.